I am well aware of the fact that it is August. I haven't really had time to film. And we can start with this book at the top, which is Giovanni's Room. And I absolutely love this book. This book is about David meeting Giovanni. David is an American that is living in Paris, and he is a closeted homosexual, basically. And this is also a time where people are not really open about homosexuality because it can be an issue for their safety. Giovanni is this, I don't know, this beautiful person that he meets. However, he's also very chaotic, and they have a very chaotic romance, but their connection between the two of them is just fantastic and amazing. We find out at the very beginning that Giovanni is in prison and that he is about to be executed. And this is basically David looking at the past relationship that they shared. And it is just one of the most beautiful and yet most tragic books that I have ever read. It's a very short read, as you can see. It's a very quick read, but it is absolutely beautiful, and it's a 5-star for me. Next on my little pile over here, I have Firekeepers Daughter. This book I partially read and partially actually listened to, and I can actually recommend the audiobook. This book is about Donis, and she lives in Canada, and she is First Nations, so she is Native Canadian, and that is the part of this book that I absolutely enjoyed. Especially when you listen to the audiobook, you can actually listen to like all of the cultural bits and all of the cultural things in their correct pronunciation, and I feel like that gives you just an extra layer of like diving deep into her culture. However, with this book, once again, I just noticed I am not a YA person. Some of the plot points are just super naive and don't really make any sense, and I kind of couldn't enjoy them because of that. Just the premise of like I guess the equivalent of the FBI using a teenager as an informant that is also not a very good informant because she's very naive and does a lot of stupid things just doesn't make sense to me at all. And also I find the love interest in this story very inappropriate. I don't know, I don't like seeing inappropriate love relationships or romantic interests just because to me I don't want to see that romanticized, especially in young adult. I only gave this book 3.5 stars, even though I did want to like it more. The next book on my list over here is called Camp Zero, and I was actually really anticipating this read because this is a dystopian read. This is further off into the future where the climate crisis has escalated so far that basically parts of the US are completely uninhabitable because they're either flooded or they're just so hot that humans can't possibly live there. This book is about a settlement very far up in the north where it's still very, very cold, and it's basically like a dystopian mystery because we don't really know what's going on at this settlement. There are some really weird things going around, and we have this point of view from Rose, who is like one of the, let's say, entertainment ladies at this northern settlement. Honestly, I just didn't like this book. It kind of just didn't have a point. I didn't feel like there was much of a plot. The pacing was really off, so in some parts where you could have had like faster paced moments, it was very slow, and in some places where maybe you need a bit of a slower pace to understand the story more, it was just too fast. I'm a very big fan of dystopian stories, but this was just not it for me, although I did like the idea, but I honestly can't even remember the ending, and I only read this in May, so that's not a good sign. So I gave this 2.5 stars. Now, the next book over here is called Writers and Lovers, and I mostly listened to this book, and I thought it was just a genuinely okay read. This book is about an author who has just lost her mother, and this book is basically about her, I don't know, situation in which she feels like she's not really going anywhere. She's working as a waitress, but she actually wants to be an author and finish her book, and she's trying to work on that on the side, but she's still carrying a lot of sadness because her mother passed away, and she's also kind of looking back on some weird love interests, and there are some throughout the story. I understand that some people might really enjoy this book, but I just wasn't in the mood for it. Not a lot happened. It was a very, very, very reflective story, but it kind of just didn't captivate me. I don't know, sometimes, sometimes that happens. Sometimes it just doesn't really speak to you, and it didn't really speak to me personally. I gave it 3 stars though, because I do think that it was very, very well written, and I have this feeling that it does speak to a lot of other people. Before I talk about the last hardbacks that I have over here, I'm going to talk about the books that I listened to or that I don't have anymore, and one of those is One True Loves. Now, most of you know that I really do like Taylor Jenkins Reid. Most of her books I really enjoy a lot, and I had high hopes for One True Loves. pause because the premise of this story is super interesting. Basically, it is about a woman whose past husband basically disappeared, and they declare him dead because he's been gone for several years now at this point. The helicopter he was traveling in went down, and so everyone assumes that he's dead. And then she meets someone new, and they get engaged, and they're, at a great point in their relationship when she finds out that her past husband is in fact not actually dead, that he survived on an island and he was finally found and brought back. So I guess it's one of those things where she kind of has to decide what guy is she going to go with, but it's also a question of what life is she going to choose, because her two husbands could not be any different from each other. The story had a really good idea, but I feel like it could have done more than it actually did. It was written well and it was very entertaining, but I do feel like it could have just gone a little bit deeper into certain aspects of the story, but it didn't. And because of that, it was also a very short read. And so you could kind of notice, okay, I think you could have gotten more out of it. So for me, it was a 3-star read, very enjoyable, but I think you could have done a bit more with the story. Another book that I read in May that I just don't have the hard copy of anymore because I really didn't like it is Bloomsbury Girls. This is historical fiction, and it's basically about several women that are working in a bookshop. To be honest, I just found this book was a bit boring. I understand what this book was trying to do because it was basically about how these 3 women eventually take ownership of the bookshop and how they're actually the people that are like completely running the business behind it. Because this is in 50s, 60s, I can't really remember, London, they're seen as lesser, they're not seen as competent because they're women. Back then, people believed that women shouldn't work, etc., etc. I get what this story was trying to do. It was like a nice historical fiction about them actually coming into their own and, and overpowering these white men that are trying to tell them what they can and can't do. But honestly, I just found this story was like the epitome of white feminism because it was truly just about like women can do anything and women can do the same thing as men. And honestly, I'm just kind of tired of stories like that. I feel like feminism in 2023 should be doing a lot more than telling stories about how white women are just as competent as white men. It just wasn't that interesting. You knew exactly where it was going to go, and I don't feel like any of the characters were interesting enough to actually captivate me. So I gave this book a 2-star because it was written quite well. It wasn't, the writing style wasn't bad or anything. It just didn't do anything for me. So the second to last book that I read in May was Upgrade, and I was actually really interested in this book. This is a science fiction, and I thought it was so interesting because it was mostly about DNA and how there is now this technology out there to basically change your DNA, like very specifically, and basically be able to give yourself superpowers. Now I'm going to spoil it for everyone. That is not how DNA works, and that's not how gene technology is going to work in the future, but I just found this super interesting, or the idea behind it was kind of interesting. Logan, the protagonist in the story, basically accidentally gets edited or upgraded, as it's called, by this like terrorist network that's trying to still advocate for upgrades or DNA upgrades. And so this whole like mystery ensues about who's the person that upgraded him, who's behind this network, and what are the most important things. And it's a whole very adventurous story that ensues. The story was kind of nice. It did have some twists and turns that I didn't expect it, but it is mostly a very adventurous science fiction. When I went into it, I did kind of hope there would be more discussion about DNA and gene editing, because that is a very big moral discussion that we need to have like on a larger scale, especially as someone who coming from that field. It's super interesting to me to see how it's interpreted in pop culture. Mostly was just like an action science fiction, and if you're looking for something like that, this is definitely entertaining, and this is definitely a recommendation for you. It wasn't quite what I was looking for, and that's why it just didn't really stick with me or inspire me in any shape or form. This obviously wasn't a very good reading month, as you can tell. So I gave this 3 stars because definitely entertaining, just not the kind of book that I am usually drawn to, so that's kind of how this turned out. Now, the last book, and the one book that I actually really did enjoy in the month of May, was Take My Hand. This book is inspired by true events, and it's basically an account of Sybil Townsend, who is a young nurse, and how she thinks she's helping in reproductive rights. Now, in the beginning of the story, she's giving birth control to 2 girls that are 11 and 13 years old, and she kind of feels like something is off with this situation. And it turns out that this birth control clinic, or this reproductive rights clinic, on the outside saying, hey, we're helping people, grab a hold of their fertility and take control of their life, is in the end doing things that they are not supposed to do on young especially poor African American women. A whole story comes out of that, and I thought it was super interesting. It did seem more of like a historical account than it was actually historical fiction, but I feel like because of that, it gave it such a touch of humanity, and you really felt like you were kind of looking at this recollection of Sybil Townsend, and it really felt like a true story. And that's why I really enjoyed this book. It felt very, very real to me. It wasn't necessarily a story that took me on an emotional journey, but it did take me, I don't know, it did feel like you were getting a good account of American history. And it is true that in American history, there were lots of experiments, especially on Black bodies, especially when it came to reproductive rights, where people were sterilized without their knowledge, for example. And this book touches on all of those subjects, and that's why I thought it was a really good read. I gave this 4 stars. It's still lacks that emotional depth that I would need like for a 5-star, but it was definitely a good book and I highly recommend this. Those are all of the books that I read in May, and I'm actually only going to be keeping this one single book, and all of the other books are actually going to be donated because it just wasn't the best month for me. As you can tell, there were just a lot of 2 stars, a lot of 3 stars. But let me know in the comments what you've been reading, if there are any books, if you had like a bad month like me in the last few months, I'd be interested to hear from you.